Melatonin. Your suprachiasmatic nucleus communicates its repeating signal of night and day to your brain and body using a circulating messenger called melatonin. Melatonin has other names too. This includes the hormone of darkness and the vampire hormone. Not because it is sinister, but simply because melatonin is released at night. Instructed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the rise in melatonin begins soon after dusk, being released into the broad stream from the pineal gland, an area situated deep in the back of your brain. Melatonin acts like a powerful bullhorn shouting out a clear message to the brain and body. It's dark, it's dark. At this moment, we have been served a writ of nighttime, and with it a biological command for the timing of sleep onset. In this way, melatonin helps regulate the timing of when sleep occurs by systematically signaling darkness throughout the organism. But melatonin has little influence on the generation of sleep itself, a mistaken assumption that many people hold. To make clear this distinction, think of sleep as the Olympic 100-meter race. Melatonin is the voice of the timing official that says, "Runners on your mark," and then fires the starting pistol that triggers the race. That timing official, melatonin, governs when the race sleep begins, but does not participate in the race. In this analogy, the sprinters themselves are other brain regions and processes that actively generate sleep. Melatonin correlates these sleep-generating regions of the brain to the certain line of bedtime. Melatonin simply provides the official instructions to commence the event of sleep, but does not participate in the sleep race itself. For these reasons, melatonin is not a powerful sleeping aid in and itself, at least not for healthy, non-jet-lagged individuals. We'll explore jet lag and how melatonin can be helpful in a moment. There may be little, if any, quality melatonin in the pill. That said, there is a significant sleep placebo effect of melatonin which should not be underestimated. The placebo effect is, after all, the most reliable effect in all of pharmacology. Equally important to realize is the fact that over-the-counter melatonin is not commonly regulated by governing bodies around the world, such as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA. Scientific evaluations of over-the-counter brands have found melatonin concentrations that range from 83% less than that claimed on the label to 78% more than that stated. Once sleep is underway, melatonin slowly decreases in concentration across the night and into the morning hours. With dawn, as sunlight enters the brain through the eyes, even through the closed lids, a brake pedal is applied to the pineal glands, thereby shutting off the release of melatonin. The absence of circulating melatonin now informs the brain and body that the finish line of sleep has been reached. It is time to call the race of sleep over and allow active wakefulness to return for the rest of the day. In this regard, we human beings are solar-powered. Then, as light fades, so too does the solar brake pedal blocking melatonin. As melatonin rises, another phase of darkness is signaled and another sleep event is called to the starting line. You can see a typical profile of melatonin release in Figure 2. It starts a few hours after dusk, then it rapidly rises, peaking around 4 a.m. Thereafter, it begins to drop as dawn approaches, falling to levels that are undetectable by early to mid-morning. Figure 2. The cycle of melatonin. have rhythm won't travel. The advent of the jet engine was a revolution for the mass transit of human beings around the planet. However, it created an unforeseen biological calamity. Jet planes offer the ability to speed through time zones faster than our 20-hour internal clocks could ever keep up with or adjust to. Those jets caused a biological time lag, jet lag. As a result, we felt tired and sleepy during the day in a distant time zone because our internal clock still thinks it is nighttime. It hasn't yet caught up. If that were not bad enough, at night we are frequently unable to initiate or maintain sleep because our internal clock now believes it to be daytime. Take the example of my recent flight home to England from San Francisco. London is 8 hours ahead of San Francisco. When I arrive in England, despite the digital clock in London's Heathrow airport telling me it is 9 a.m., my internal circadian clock is registering a very different time, California time, which is 1 a.m. I should be fast asleep. I will drag my time-lagged brain and body through the London day in a state of deep lethargy. Every aspect of my biology is demanding sleep, sleep that most people back in California are being swaddled in at this time. The worst, however, is yet to come. By midnight, London time, I'm in bed, tired and wanting to fall asleep. But unlike most people in London, I can't seem to drift off. Though it is midnight in London, my internal biological clock believes it to be 4 p.m., which it is in California. I would normally be wide awake, and so I am, lying in bed in London. It will be 5 or 6 hours before my natural tendency to fall asleep arrives, just as London is starting to wake up and I have to give a public lecture. What a mess. This is jet lag. You feel tired and sleepy during the day in the new time zone because your body clock and associated biology cell think it is nighttime. At night, you are frequently unable to sleep solidly because your biological rhythm still believes it to be daytime. Fortunately, my brain and body will not stay in this mismatched limbo forever. I will acclimatize to London time by way of the sunlight signals in the new location. But it's a slow process. For every day you are in a different time zone, your suprachiasmatic nucleus can only readjust by about 1 hour. It therefore took me about 8 days to readjust to London time after having been in San Francisco, since London is 8 hours ahead of San Francisco. Sadly, after such epic efforts by my suprachiasmatic nucleus's 24-hour clock to drag itself forward the time I get settled in London, it faces some depressing news. I now have to fly back to San Francisco after 9 days. My poor biological clock has to suffer this struggle all over again in this reserve direction. You may have noticed that it feels harder to acclimate to a new time zone when traveling eastward than when flying westward. There are 2 reasons for this. First, the eastward direction requires that you fall asleep earlier than you would normally, which is a tall biological order for the mind to simply will into action. In contrast, the westward direction requires you to stay up later, which is a consciously and pragmatically easier prospect. Second, you will remember that when shut off from any outside world influences, our natural circadian rhythm is innately longer than 1 day, about 24 hours and 15 minutes. Modest as this may be, this makes it somewhat easier for you to artificially stretch a day than shrink it. When you travel westward in the direction of your innately longer internal clock, that day is longer than 24 hours for you, and why it feels a little easier to accommodate too. Eastward travel, however, which involves a day that is shorter in length for you than 24 hours, goes against the grain of your innately long internal rhythm to start with, which is why it is rather harder to do. West or east? Jet lag still places a torturous physiological strain on the brain and a deep biological stress upon the cells, organs, and major systems of the body. And there are consequences. Scientists have studied airplane cabin crews who frequently fly on long-haul routes and have little chance to recover. Two alarming results have emerged. First, parts of their brains, specifically those related to learning and memory, had physically shrunk, suggesting the destruction of brain cells caused by the biological stress of time zone travel. Second, their short-term memory was significantly impaired. They were considerably more forgetful than individuals of similar age and background who did not frequently travel through time zones. Other studies of pilots, cabin crew members, and shift workers have reported additionally disquieting consequences, including far higher rates of cancer and type 2 diabetes than the general population, or even carefully controlled matched individuals who do not travel as much. Based on these deleterious effects, you can appreciate why some people faced with frequent jet lag, including airline pilots and cabin crew, would want to limit such misery. Often, they choose to take melatonin pills in an attempt to help with the problem. Recall my flight from San Francisco to London? After arriving that day, I had real difficulty getting to sleep and staying asleep that night. In part, this was because melatonin was not being released during my night time in London. My melatonin rise was still many hours away back on California time. But let's imagine that I was going to use a legitimate compound of melatonin after arriving in London. Here's how it works. Around 7 to 8 p.m. London time, I would take a melatonin pill, triggering an artificial rise in circulating melatonin that mimics the natural melatonin spike currently occurring in most of the people in London. As a consequence, my brain is fooled into believing it's nighttime, and with that chemically induced trick, it becomes signaled time of the sleep race. It will still be a struggle to generate the event of sleep itself at this irregular time for me. But the timing signal does not significantly increase the likelihood of sleep in this jet-lagged context. Sleep pressure and caffeine. Your 24-hour circadian rhythm is the first of the two factors determining wake and sleep. The second is sleep pressure. At this very moment, a chemical called adenosine is building up in your brain. It will continue to increase in concentration with every waking minute that elapses. The longer you are awake, the more adenosine will accumulate. Think of adenosine as a chemical barometer that continuously registers the amount of elapsed time since you woke up this morning. One consequence of increasing adenosine in the brain is an increase in desire to sleep. This is known as sleep pressure, and it is the second force that will determine when you feel sleepy, and thus should go to bed. Using a clever dual action effect, high concentration of adenosine simultaneously turn down the volume of wake-promoting regions in the brain and turn up the dial of sleep-inducing regions. As a result of that chemical sleep pressure, when adenosine concentrations peak, an irresistible urge for slumber will take hold. It happens to most people after 12 to 16 hours of being awake. You can, however, artificially mute the sleep signal of adenosine by using a chemical that makes you feel more alert and awake: caffeine. Caffeine is not a food supplement. Rather, caffeine is the most widely used and abused psychoactive stimulant in the world. It is the second most traded commodity on the planet, after oil. The conception of caffeine represents one of the longest and largest unsupervised drug studies ever conducted on the human race, perhaps rivaled only by alcohol, and it continues to this day. Caffeine works by successfully battling with adenosine for the privilege of latching on to adenosine welcome sites or receptors in the brain. Once caffeine occupies these receptors, however, it does not stimulate them like adenosine make you sleepy. Rather, caffeine blocks and effectively inactivates the receptors, acting as a masking agent. It's the equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears to shut out a sound. By hijacking and occupying these receptors, caffeine blocks the sleepiness signal normally communicated to the brain by adenosine. The upshot: caffeine tricks you into feeling alert and awake, despite the high levels of adenosine that would otherwise seduce you into sleep. Levels of circulating caffeine peak approximately 30 minutes after oral administration. What is problematic, though, is the persistence of caffeine in your system. In pharmacology, we use the term half-life when discussing a drug's efficacy. This simply refers to the length of time it takes for the body to remove 50% of a drug's concentration. Caffeine has an average half-life of 5 to 7 hours. Let's say that you have a cup of coffee after your evening dinner around 7:30 p.m. This means that by 1:30 a.m., 50% of that caffeine may still be active and circulating throughout your brain tissue. In other words, by 1:30 a.m., you're only halfway to completing the job of cleansing your brain of the caffeine you drank after dinner. There's nothing beneath our that 50% mark neither. Half a shot of caffeine is still plenty powerful, and much more decomposition work lies ahead throughout the night before caffeine disappears. Sleep will not come easily or be smooth throughout the night as your brain continues its battle against the opposing force of caffeine. Most people do not realize how long it takes to overcome a single dose of caffeine, and therefore fail to make the link between the bad nights of sleep we make from in the morning and the cup of coffee we had 10 hours earlier with dinner. Caffeine, which is not only prevalent in coffee, certain teas, and many energy drinks, but also foods such as dark chocolate and ice cream, as well as drugs such as weight loss pills and pain relievers, is one of the most common culprits that keep people from falling asleep easily and sleeping soundly thereafter, typically masquerading as insomnia, an actual medical condition. Also, be aware that decaffeinated does not mean non-caffeinated. 1 cup of decaf usually contains 15 to 13% of the dose of a regular cup of coffee, which is far from caffeine-free. Should you drink 3 to 4 cups of decaf in the evening, it is just as damaging to your sleep as 1 regular cup of coffee. The jolt of caffeine does wear off. Caffeine is removed from your system by an enzyme within your liver, which gradually degrades it over time. Based in large part on genetics, some people have a more efficient version of the enzyme that degrades caffeine, allowing the liver to rapidly clear it from the bloodstream. These rare individuals can drink an espresso with dinner and fall fast asleep at midnight without a problem. Others, however, have a slow-acting version of the enzyme. It takes far longer for their system to eliminate the same amount of caffeine. As a result, they are very sensitive to caffeine's effects. 1 cup of tea or coffee in the morning will last much of the day, and should they have a second cup, even early in the afternoon, they will find it difficult to fall asleep in the evening. Aging also alters the speed of caffeine clearance. The older we are, the longer it takes our brain and body to remove caffeine, and thus the more sensitive we become in later life to caffeine's sleep-disrupting influence. If you are trying to stay awake late into the night by drinking coffee, you should be prepared for a nasty consequence when your liver successfully evicts the caffeine from your system. A phenomenon commonly known as caffeine crash. Like the batteries running down on a toy robot, your energy levels plummet rapidly. You find it difficult to function, concentrate, with a strong sense of sleepiness once again. We now understand why. For the entire time that caffeine is in your system, the sleepiness chemical it blocks, the adenosine, nevertheless continues to build up. Your brain is not aware of this rising tide of sleep-encouraging adenosine. However, because the wall of caffeine you've created is holding it back from your perception, but once your liver dismantles that barricade of caffeine, you feel a vicious backlash. You are hit with the sleepiness you had experimented 2 or 3 hours ago before you drank that cup coffee plus all the extra adenosine that has accumulated in the hours in between. Impatiently waiting for caffeine to leave, when the receptors became fastened by way of caffeine decomposition, adenosine rushes back in and smothers the receptors. When this happens, you are assaulted with a most forceful adenosine trigger urge to sleep, the aforementioned caffeine crash. Unless you consume even more caffeine to push back against the weight of adenosine, which would start a dependency cycle, you are going to find it very, very difficult to remain awake. To impress upon you the effects of caffeine, a footnote esoteric research conducted in the 1980s by NASA. Their scientists exposed spiders to different drugs and then observed the webs that they constructed. Those drugs included LSD, speed amphetamine, marijuana, and caffeine. The results, which speak for themselves, can be observed in Figure 3. The researchers noted how strikingly incapable the spiders were in constructing anything resembling a normal or logical web that would be of any functional use when given caffeine, even relative to other potent drugs tested. Figure 3. Effects of various drugs on spider web building. It is worth pointing out that caffeine is a stimulant drug. Caffeine is also the only addictive substance that we readily give to our children and teens, the consequences of which we will return later in the book. In step, out of step. Setting caffeine aside for a moment, you may have assumed that the two governing forces that regulate your sleep, the 24-hour circadian rhythm of the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the sleep pressure signal of adenosine, communicate with each other so as to unite their influences. In actual fact, they don't. They are two distant and separate systems that are ignorant of each other. They are not coupled, though they are usually aligned. Figure 4 encompasses 48 hours of time from left to right, 2 days and 2 nights. The dotted line in the figure is the circadian rhythm, also known as process T. Like a sine wave, it reliably and repeatedly rises and falls, and then rises and falls once more. Starting on the far left of the figure, the circadian rhythm begins to increase its activity a few hours before you wake up. It infuses the brain and body with an alerting energy signal. Think of it like a rousing marching band approaching from a distance. At first the signal is faint, but gradually builds and builds and builds with time. By early afternoon in most healthy adults, the activating signal from the circadian rhythm peaks. Figure 4. The two factors regulating sleep and wakefulness. Now, let us consider what is happening to the other sleep controlling factor, adenosine. Adenosine creates a pressure to sleep, also known as process S, represented by the solid line in figure 4. The longer you are awake, the more adenosine builds up, creating an increasing urge pressure to sleep. By mid to late morning, you have only been awake for a handful of hours. As a result, adenosine concentrations have increased only a little. Furthermore, the circadian rhythm is on its powerful upswing of alertness. This combination of strong activating outputs from the circadian rhythm, together with low levels of adenosine, results in a delightful sensation of being wide awake, or at least it should, so long as your sleep was of good quality and sufficient length the night before. If you feel as though you could fall asleep easily mid-morning, you are very likely not getting enough sleep, or the quality of your sleep is insufficient. The distance between the curved lines above will be a direct reflection of your desire to sleep. The larger the distance between the two, the greater your sleep desire. For example, at 11 a.m., after having woken up at 8 a.m., there is only a small distance between the dotted line circadian rhythm and solid line sleep pressure, illustrated by the vertical double row in figure 5. This minimal difference means there is a weak sleep drive and a strong urge to be awake and alert. Figure 5. The urge to be awake. However, by 11 p.m., it's a very different situation as illustrated in Figure 6. You've now been awake for 15 hours and your brain is drenched in high concentrations of adenosine. Note how the solid line in the figure has risen sharply. In addition, the dotted line of the circadian rhythm is descending, powering down your activity and alertness levels. As a result, the difference between the two lines has grown large, reflected in the long vertical double row in Figure 6. This powerful combination of abundant adenosine, high sleep pressure, and declining circadian rhythm, lowered activity levels, triggers a strong desire for sleep. Figure 6. The urge to sleep. What happens to all of the accumulated adenosines once you do fall asleep? During sleep, a mass evacuation gets underway as the brain has the chance to degrade and remove the day's adenosine. Across the night, sleep lifts the heavy weight of sleep pressure, lightening the adenosine load after approximately 8 hours of healthy sleep in an adult. The adenosine purging is complete. Just as this process is ending, the marching band of your circadian activity rhythm has fortuitously returned, and its energizing influence starts to approach. When these two processes trade places in the morning hours, wherein adenosine has been removed and the rising volume of the circadian rhythm is becoming louder, indicates by the meeting of the two lines in Figure 6, we naturally wake up 7 a.m. on day 2 in the figure example. Following that full night of sleep, you are now ready to face another 16 hours of wakefulness with physical vigor and a sharp brain function. Independence Day and Night. Have you ever pulled an all-nighter, foregoing sleep and remaining awake throughout the following day? If you have and can remember much of anything about it, you may recall that there were times when you felt truly miserable and sleepy, yet there were other moments when, despite having been awake for longer, you paradoxically felt more alert. Why? I don't advise anyone to conduct these self-experiments, but assessing a person's alertness across 24 hours of total sleep deprivation is one way that scientists can demonstrate that the two forces determining when you want to be awake and asleep, the 24-hour circadian rhythm and the sleeping signal of adenosine, are independent and can be decoupled from their normal lockstep. Let's consider figure 7, showing the same 48-hour slice of time and the two factors in question, the 24-hour circadian rhythm and the sleep pressure signal of adenosine, and how much distance there is between them. In this scenario, our volunteer is going to stay awake all night and all day. As the night of sleep deprivation marches forward, the sleep pressure of adenosine upper line rises progressively, like the rising water sleep in a plunged sink with a faucet has been left on. It will not decline across the night. It cannot, since sleep is absent. Figure 7. The ebb and flow of sleep deprivation. By remaining awake and blocking access to the adenosine drain as sleep opens up, the brain is unable to rid itself of the chemical sleep pressure. The mounting adenosine levels continues to rise. This should mean that the longer you are awake, the sleepier you feel. But that's not true. Though you will feel increasingly sleepy throughout the nighttime phase, hitting a low point in your alertness around 5 to 6 a.m., thereafter you'll catch a second wind. How is this possible when adenosine levels or corresponding sleep pressure continue to increase? The answer resides with your 24-hour circadian rhythm, which offers a brief period of salvation from sleepiness. Unlike sleep pressure, your circadian rhythm pays no attention to whether you are asleep or awake. Its slow, rhythmic countenance continues to fall and rise strictly on the basis of what time of night or day it is. No matter what state of adenosine sleepiness pressure exists within the brain, the 24-hour circadian rhythm cycles on as per usual, oblivious to your ongoing lack of sleep. If you look at figure 7 once again, the graveyard shift misery you experience around 6 a.m. can be explained by the combination of high adenosine sleep pressure, your circadian rhythm reaching its lowest point. The vertical distance separating these two lines at 3 a.m. It's large indicated by the first vertical arrow in the figure. But if you can make it past this alertness low point, you're in for a rally. The morning rise of the circadian rhythm comes to your rescue, marshalling an alerting boost throughout the morning that temporarily offsets the rising levels of adenosine sleep pressure. As your circadian rhythm hits its peak around 11 a.m., the vertical distance between the two respective lines in figure 7 has been decreased. The upshot is that you will feel much less sleepy at 11 a.m. than you did at 3 a.m., despite being awake for longer. Sadly, the second wind doesn't last. As the afternoon lumbers on, the circadian rhythm begins to decline as the escalating adenosine piles on the sleep pressure. Come late afternoon and early evening, any temporary alertness boost has been lost. You are hit by the full force of an immense adenosine sleep pressure. By 9 p.m., there exists a towering vertical distance between the two lines in figure 7. Short of intravenous caffeine or amphetamine, sleep will have its way, wresting your brain from the now weak grip of blurry wakefulness, blanketing you in slumber. Am I getting enough sleep? Setting aside the extreme case of sleep deprivation, how do you know whether you're routinely getting enough sleep? While a clinical sleep assessment is needed to throughout address this issue, an easy rule of thumb is to answer two simple questions. First, after waking up in the morning, could you fall back asleep at 10 or 11 a.m.? If the answer is yes, you're likely not getting sufficient sleep quantity and or quality. Second, can you function optimally without caffeine before noon? If the answer is no, then you are most likely self-medicating your state of chronic sleep deprivation. Both of these signs you should take seriously and seek to address your sleep deficiency. They are topics and a question that we will cover in depth in chapters 13 and 14 when we speak about the factors that prevent and harm your sleep, as well as insomnia and effective treatments. In general, these unrefreshed feelings that compel a person to fall back asleep mid-morning or require the boosting of alertness with caffeine are usually due to individuals not giving themselves adequate sleep opportunity time, at least 8 or 9 hours in bed. When you don't get enough sleep, one consequence among many is that adenosine concentration remain too high, like an outstanding debt on a loan. Come the morning, some quantity of yesterday's adenosine remains. You then carry the outstanding sleepiness balance throughout the following day. Also, like a loan in arrears, this sleep debt will continue to accumulate. You cannot hide from it. The debt will roll over into the next payment cycle and the next, producing a condition of prolonged chronic sleep deprivation from one day to another. This outstanding sleep obligation results in a feeling of chronic fatigue manifesting in many forms of mental and physical ailments that are now rife throughout industrialized nations. Other questions that can draw out signs of insufficient sleep are: if you didn't set an alarm clock, would you sleep past that time? If so, you need more sleep that you are giving yourself. Do you find yourself at your computer screen reading and then rereading, and perhaps rereading again the same sentence? This is often a sign of a fatigued, underslept brain. Do you sometimes forget what color the last few traffic lights were while driving? Simple distraction is often the cause, but a lack of sleep is very much another culprit. Of course, even you are giving yourself plenty of time to get a full night of shut eye. Next day, fatigue and sleepiness can still occur because you are suffering from an undiagnosed sleep disorder, of which there are now more than 100. The most common is insomnia, followed by sleep disordered breathing or sleep apnea, which includes heavy snoring. Should you suspect your of anyone else to resulting in daytime fatigue, impairment, or distress, speak to your doctor immediately and seek a referral to a sleep specialist. Most important in this regard, do not seek sleeping pills as your first option. You will realize why I say this come chapter 14. But please feel free to skip right to the section on sleeping pills in that chapter if you are a current user or considering using sleeping pills in the immediate future. In the event it helps, I have provided a link to a questionnaire that has been developed by sleep researchers that will allow you to determine your degree of sleep fulfillment, called SATED. It is easy to complete and contains only 5 simple questions.